Hello, and thank you very much for tuning into my presentation. I'm Jens van Geesel from the University of New Mexico, and I'll be talking today about causative-applicative polysemy in Sanapaná. I will first start by our land acknowledgement. Founded in 1989, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia, the original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. And I also want to thank the funding agencies that made this research possible, and all the Sanapaná people who helped me with it, and specifically Cecilio Teitaro, Regino Teitaro, and Alcides Alvarez, who worked with me over Skype this semester. Okay, let's dive into it then. So there's a fair number of languages where a single strategy is used to express both causative meanings, so subject adding meanings, and applicative functions, so functions that add an object to the valency of the verb. If we look at this Tariana example, for example, here in A, we have a verb for call plus a suffix ta, which introduces a person called for to the valency of this verb, so an object-like participant, whereas in B, with the verb for sleep, it performs a causative function and adds a causer, a new A argument to the valency of the verb. In Sanapaná, a language belonging to the Enlhet-Enenlhet language family spoken in Paraguay, there is a similar polysemous causative-applicative morpheme. So in A, we have the verb for make, which is usually just a transitive. You have a maker and something that's made. You add the suffix, in this case s, and then you add a kind of goal or beneficiary participant is added to the valency of the verb. So in this case, the arrows for which bird feathers are made. Whereas in B, we have the verb for come out, and the same suffix is added and results in a causative meaning. So you get cause to come out or cause to emerge. In this presentation, I will describe the syntax, semantics, and lexical distribution of this morpheme, and try to propose some motivating factors for at least the lexical distribution. I will do so based on a corpus of transcribed oral historical narratives. We'll use naturalistic examples wherever possible, but mostly I'll be relying on a corpus of elicitation sessions, both in person and over Skype, because I'd like to use kind of minimal pairs or near minimal pairs from the same verb. Okay, Sanapaná then, for a bit of geographical context, is spoken in the Paraguayan part of the Gran Chaco region, so this large plains area spanning parts of Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Argentina. Specifically, the data for this research were connected in the La Esperanza community, which is the little yellow triangle around here, which is about a 7-hour bus ride away from Asunción. Sanapaná is generally predicate initial. The participant, noun, phrase, or pronoun may follow the predicate in any order. They may also be null instantiated if they are highly accessible and topical in discourse. And there is a dedicated construction where one participant may precede the verb when it is either focused or it answers to a question, something like that. And that triggers the appearance of a specialized suffix on the verb. Sanapaná has little to no case marking, except for a couple of grammaticalizing or recently grammaticalized constructions that look like oblique prepositional phrases, but that are still transparently verbal. And usually the S or A argument is cross-referenced on the verb, except in a transitive clause or a ditransitive. If there is a first-person argument, then that gets indicated on the verb no matter what. A couple of examples to illustrate the basics of the argument structure of Sanapaná, because that's pretty relevant to this talk on causatives and applicatives. So at A, you can see kind of the most basic clause structure. You have a clause initial predicate, a verb, and is followed by two participant noun phrases. B shows that participants do not need to be overtly expressed if they're known from previous discourse. So here, the thing that is being filled, the fruits, is not expressed at all in this sentence. In a passive, in C, you can see that the original A argument, so the most active participant, cannot be overtly expressed at all. And it is instead only the original O, so in this case, the homelands, that is cross-referenced on the verb. For A shows this dedicated information structure construction with a preverbal participant that I talked about. And you can see that this "-ak" suffix appears on the verb to go along with that. And then in 5, we can see that they despised us. The O argument is first person, and then that is what is cross-referenced on the verb. It uses this prefix "e" instead of "us", which is used for first person singular or first person A arguments. A couple of notes on the form of this suffix, this polysemous causative applicative suffix that we're going to be talking about. It usually looks like s or us or kes or kas in the non-future. Whether or not this k appears depends mostly on the segmental structure of the root. So the k appears when the root ends in a single consonant. It doesn't appear when the root ends in a double consonant. In the future, we have this glottal stop appearing as well. The future is the vowel initial suffix. So this seems to largely be to kind of maintain CVC syllable structures. So most of the variations in the form here are phonologically predictable. This suffix directly follows the root in the large majority of cases, except for a couple of cases where a kind of directional or a spectral suffix has lexicalized together with a root. So here we have carry with kind of a motion away from the deictic center marker, which are lexicalized together. And then the applicative in this case appears outside of that. Interestingly, this morpheme can be applied twice in sequence with a variety of different possible effects, as we will see later. And the suffix can also pretty much freely co-occur with any other post-root morphology. All right, I'll now move on to giving an overview of the functions of this morpheme, what it does semantically and what the morphosyntactic effects on argument structure constructions are. I will go over these examples pretty quickly because this is pre-recorded, so if you're interested, you can pause it whenever you want. So here on this slide, first we see an intransitive verb for work. The worker is cross-referenced on the verb, and if we apply this valency increaser on it, it has a causative effect. So she would make them work, and we get the causer cross-referenced on the verb, in this case a feminine. The worker, so the original S argument, is no longer found on the verb. It's pretty straightforward behavior for a causative. Now, with intransitive roots, so like with this work verb, the original single participant now behaves like a regular object, object-like participant. That means that it can, if it is first person, it gets cross-referenced on the verb with this a prefix. So she's making me work. We don't have the he or the she, the third person cross-referenced on the verb. Instead, we have the first person singular o prefix. The one who's made to work can also be expressed as the S argument of a passive. So they were made to work, in which case they also get cross-referenced on the verb. When a transitive verb is causativized, the result is something like a double object construction, even though, as I said, there is very little case marking anyway. So yeah, that might not be the most useful term in the Sanapaná case. But what I mean to say is that, say for here, make drink, both the causee, the person who's actually drinking, and the thing that is being drunk appear typically post-verbally as unmarked noun phrases. They behave the same under passivization, so both the causee can appear as the S argument of a corresponding passive. My younger brother was caused to drink water. You get the masculine prefix on this verb. but you can also have the water was caused to be drunk, in which case the drunk thing gets cross-referenced on the verb. In this case, though, speakers seem to be kind of ambivalent on whether this C example allows for overt expression of the drinker, of the causee. So this might indicate some kind of an imbalance between these two, let's say, non-causer or non-A arguments. But speakers' judgments on that are sometimes inconsistent. Those two arguments, so the causee and the kind of original O, also behave the same with respect to being expressed on the verb if they are first person. So Dotto made his dog bite me, where the bitten thing, the original O, is first person, gets marked on the verb, whereas Dotto made me bite some leather. For example, if he is performing a painful medical procedure on me, then the first person singular causee also gets cross-referenced on the verb. With another set of verbs, this morpheme functions as an applicative, and it adds semantically an affected participant to the argument structure. So typically that will be a beneficiary or maleficiary. Syntactically, this can be expressed in a number of ways. For example, here in 1b, I bought Eduardo's palm hearts. The beneficiary, in this case, the person that I'm buying from, is not expressed as an independent noun phrase, but it is a possessor inside the original O noun phrase. In C, however, it's pretty clear that he bought bread rolls for Kyla. This is an independent noun phrase that is now added to the valency of the verb. It can be seen that this new affected participant is in fact added to the valency of the verb because when the verb is not derived, this non-derived root for by cannot cross-reference a first person singular beneficiary. A beneficiary cannot appear in the clause as an unmarked noun phrase. You need a one of these seemingly grammaticalizing deverbal oblique constructions for that. And a beneficiary cannot be expressed as an S argument in the corresponding passive. So you cannot have Cecilio was plucked a fruit. That cannot be expressed with the underived root for pluck, passivized with a masculine prefix on there. You would need to use the valency increaser on this first. So while the affect T that is added by the applicative, as we saw before, may be a syntactic dependent, a possessor in a noun phrase, that can also equally function as the S argument of a passive. So here we have plow for, basically, and then passivized. So I guess be plowed for somebody, and that can either cross-reference the beneficiary, in this case Cecilio, or the thing that is being plowed, in this case the field. Again, the two non-A arguments behave in the same way with respect to this passive construction. Once again, both the affect T and the original O may also be prefixed on the verb if they are first person. I'm going to go over these a bit more quickly. So far, what I've been shown has been pretty typical for polysemous causative-applicative morphemes. So the morpheme takes on a causative reading or an applicative reading depending on the root it attaches to, and it adjusts argument structure kind of accordingly. But what seems much rarer and outside of the Enlhet-Enenlhet languages, I've only really seen it in Austin's discussion of Australian languages, is that the causative-applicative morpheme can attach twice to the same root. So it's not unheard of for straightforward causatives, but for these polysemous morphemes, I've rarely seen it. And the effect of the second addition of this valency increaser depends on what effect the first iteration has. So here, for example, we have two verbs where if you add this morpheme once, you introduce a causer, it gets a causative reading. And the second iteration then adds the complementary applicative reading. So we have be hard or be strong. With the first application of this morpheme, you get make something hard or make something strong, and then the second application gets you make something hard or strong for someone else. Here as well, you have work, make Cecilio's son work, and then if you add this guess again, you get I made, or my son worked for Cecilio. You get both the causative and the applicative readings. That seems to be the case regardless of whether the root is transitive or intransitive. It seems to happen for all the verbs where a single iteration of this suffix results in a causative meaning. When this pattern is found, both the causee and the affectee can once again be indexed on the verb in a corresponding passive. So here we have make work for someone, is passivized, and it's got a masculine prefix on it. This masculine prefix can refer either to the causee, the person that's being made to work, or to the beneficiary. So you can have either my older brother was caused to work for Vicenta, or my older brother had Vicenta caused to work for him. It's not very good English, but yeah, this is meant to express a reading where the beneficiary is the S argument of this passive. Once again, both causee and affectee can be indexed on the verb if they are first person. They are also, as we saw here, expressed in non-case marked noun phrases, so they seem to show the same behavior. A second pattern when with a seemingly smaller set of verbs, but still considerable. Well, actually, no, this is a very small set of verbs. Is that the first iteration of this suffix has an applicative reading, so adds an object-like participant, and then the second iteration adds another object-like participant on top of that. So here, patmet, speak, is intransitive. You can usually not have an addressee expressed as an unmarked noun phrase in that clause. With the valency increaser, you can. So you get addressee introduced to the valency. I spoke with Dotto. If you add it twice, you add another kind of object-like participant. I spoke to Dotto on behalf of my wife, so you get a beneficiary. Again, two unmarked post-verbal noun phrases. Once again, both these added objects, both the goal or addressee and the affectee, can be indexed on the verb in a corresponding passive. So Dotto was spoken to on behalf of my wife. We get masculine cross-reference, or someone spoke to Dotto on my wife's behalf. You can also cross-reference the wife with the feminine prefix. And then thirdly, with a fairly big set of verbs, the first iteration of this morpheme will have an applicative reading, so it'll add an object, whereas the second reading does not seem to have any added effect, neither semantic nor syntactic. The argument structure seems to be the same as whenever there is just a single applicative. So both asnatsleski and asnatsleskiski mean I plucked something for somebody. You can see here that the recipient or the beneficiary and the plucked thing, they look exactly the same. And once again, they behave the same under passivization as well. So the different functions of this polysemous causative-applicative morpheme when it is suffixed to a root once and twice seem to fall into four main patterns, each of which is shown by a category of verbs which seems to have a recognizable semantic core, but also contains verbs that have meanings beyond this core, and does not contain all the items that belong to this core. So I surveyed about 200 verbs, not sampled in a balanced way, however, so I don't really claim that the numbers presented here are representative of the Sanapaná lexicon as a whole. But I think the trends that are shown are pretty strong and likely mean something. So I'll just give some representative examples here and run through them quite quickly, because once again, you can pause whenever you want. So the most common pattern seems to be the one where one iteration of the suffix yields a causative meaning, and a second one results in an applicative meaning. That's the case with a lot of roots expressing properties, both stable and transitory. So you have be yellow, make yellow for someone, be dry, and make dry for someone else. It's also the case with bodily functions. So you have urinate and make urinate, for example, help a child or an elder urinate, and then help someone urinate to help out somebody else. It is the case with a lot of verbs that express spatial configuration and motion. So you have enter, make or let enter, and make or let enter, for example, somebody's relative or somebody to help somebody else. And then there's kind of a disparate category of other intransitive volitional or non-volitional processes and changes of state. So things like get used to, cause someone to get used to, or train somebody, and then train somebody for someone else. The work example that we saw earlier, or be cooked, cook something and cook something for someone else. The second major pattern is the one where one iteration of the suffix has an applicative reading and the second has no further effect. That is the case with a lot of verbs that express creation. So you have make fire for, and then seemingly no further effect with the second addition. Same with cook or plant. This is the case with a lot of verbs that express caused changes of state. So break something for, tear something for, kill something for. It's also the case with a lot of verbs of caused motion. So put something somewhere for someone else. Then the third pattern, for which for now I have about 16 verbs, is one where the first iteration of the suffix results in an ambiguous new stem, which can have either the causative or the applicative reading. That seems to be mostly the case with verbs of ingestion and sensory experience. So we have eat with this suffix can either mean feed someone or eat someone else's food. Same with drink. And then with things like listen and see, we get, for example, show something, so cause to see, or see something that someone else has created. And then the second addition of this suffix has pretty much the expected effect. So it can either add a beneficiary to the causative reading, feed, this has to be feed somebody else's, food, I guess. So you get the maleficiary here, the person whose food is eaten, being added in addition to having the causative reading. Or you can simply have the regular applicativized reading, similar to when the morpheme is added once, which is basically the same as that previous pattern I showed. And then the last pattern is the one that I discussed before, where one applicative or one iteration of the suffix adds a goal participant, and then the second one adds another affectee. So basically two applicatives. And that seems to mostly be the case with verbs that imply some kind of communication. So you get talk to somebody for somebody else, whistle to somebody, and whistle to somebody to give somebody else a signal or something like that. So I'm not going to try to explain how this morpheme ended up with these two meanings and with the distribution that it has, because that would require diachronic study in comparison with related languages. For example, there's some interesting differences in Enlhet-Sur, where the morpheme seems to be more broadly polysemous than in Sanapaná, potentially allowing both the readings with more different verbs than what Sanapaná allows. Whereas in Enlhet, the ambiguity or the set of verbs with which both readings are allowed might be more restricted. But taking a synchronic perspective on the Sanapaná data, I think principles of iconicity, specifically iconicity of distance or contiguity, can at least partly motivate the behavior and distribution of this morpheme. So it has been argued that, for example, according to Hyman, the linguistic distance between expressions corresponds to the conceptual distance between them. how distance or contiguity should be defined has been much debated, for example, by Croft and Haspelmath, but I will not get into that here. I'll just assume that most people will agree that the distance between bound items is smaller than between free items, and if all else is equal, like the distance between contiguous items is smaller than between non-contiguous ones. So on the one hand, I believe that such iconicity of distance motivates the function of this polysemous valency increaser when it attaches to a root once. It has often been proposed that if a language has distinct lexical, morphological, and periphrastic causative constructions, the latter, so the less bound ones, are more likely to be used for more indirect, coercive kind of causations, whereas the former, the more integrated ones formally, are more likely to be used for more direct and physical kinds of causation. Sanapaná does have two of those different constructions. So you get the morphological causative that we've been talking about. You also have a periphrastic causative with the verb for send or order, basically. So if you want to say, I made my child kill the chicken, you have to use this verb and basically say, I ordered him to kill the chicken. So as we saw before, a lot of the verbs with which the first application of this valency increaser results in an applicative reading are transitive. Like cause change of state, cause change of motion, things like that. And they typically have volitional and animate subjects, which means that causing such events to occur will more likely require coercion or psychological causation rather than direct physical causation. It's hard to directly physically cause someone else to make a fire. You know, I would have to hold their hands, and the fine motor skills required for that don't really allow for that. So in the real world, the causation of such events will be more likely to be more indirect. It's therefore expected that they will be more likely to use the periphrastic construction using order. And that is what we see with those verbs. The causative reading with this valency increaser tends to be excluded. On the other hand, the verbs that do take the causative reading with the first iteration of this valency increaser, they are often stative, or they express changes of state in inanimate entities, for example, so they are easier to bring about through direct physical causation. Therefore, there is a closer semantic connection between the caused event and the caused event and the causing event, and they are, you would expect them to be more likely to use the morphological, formally more integrated causative construction, according to this iconicity of distance. So interestingly, there is like a category of exceptions that seems to kind of confirm this intuition, which is the category of motion verbs. So those do have volitional actors, but they still take the morphological causative. And I argue that that is because something like simple translational motion can much more easily be caused directly through physical means, by carrying someone or by physically leading someone somewhere, than those actions discussed before that require fine motor skills. So Sanapaná does here follow kind of cross-linguistic patterns in the distribution of causative morphology, which in many languages only applies to intransitives. And it also kind of adheres to a potential tendency of ingestion verbs to be exceptions to such patterns. So whenever a language has a morphological causative that is applicable only to intransitives and small sets of transitives, these small sets of transitives are usually ingestion verbs. I think this iconicity idea can also be used to motivate the function of the second iteration of the causative-applicative morpheme with different derived stems. And for that, we'll have to take a look at the concept of relevance, defined by Bybee as a meaning element is relevant to another meaning element if the semantic content of the first directly affects or modifies the semantic content of the second. The idea here is that items whose meanings are more relevant to each other are more likely to occur in closer contiguity. So semantic categories that are frequently expressed morphologically, like tense, aspect, and modality, can kind of be ranked in order of their relevance to the event expressed by the root. And their relative order is typically motivated by this. So in our case, with causatives and applicatives, causatives are argued by Bybee to have a very drastic, let's say, effect on verb meanings. And it's also intuitively, being yellow is a very different event from making something yellow to state, as opposed to a volitional caused change of state. On the other hand, plucking a fruit or plowing a field is pretty much the same event, whether you're doing it for yourself or whether that field belongs to someone else, or whether you're intending to later give that fruit to someone else. So iconicity would lead us to expect if a causative and an applicative appears together, we would expect the causative to occur closer to the root than the applicative. So in our Sanapaná case, if we have a root plus valency increaser combination that has a causative reading, it is felicitous to add that valency increaser again with the applicative reading, because the more relevant meaning, the causative, is added first and can be seen as appearing closer to the root. However, if such a root plus valency increaser combination has an applicative meaning already, then adding the causative reading to that is infelicitous, because you can analyze it as the more relevant meaning being added last and appearing further away from the root. So it kind of goes against this ideal ordering that we would expect or following the iconicity idea. And then in addition, I've argued above that the fact that these root plus valency increaser combinations with those verbs like pluck and plow and stuff, that they take applicative meanings to begin with, is because the morphological causative is dispreferred already, because their causation is more likely to be indirect. And then since the addition of the applicative does not really change anything to the event structure of these events that would make them more likely to be caused directly or physically, like causing someone to plow a field for somebody else is not easier to cause directly than just causing someone to plow a field. I think the same reasoning still holds. And then interesting to see in this regard is that these applicative plus applicative readings, which first add an addressee or a goal and then a beneficiary, in my view, do conform to this prediction based on iconicity. If we get speak plus one applicative that introduces this interlocutor, so a participant closely involved in the event, and it makes quite a big difference in event structure. Whereas the second applicative adds a beneficiary who is arguably less relevant to this event structure, because, intuitively, monologuing versus having a conversation are very different events, whereas having a conversation just like that or having a conversation for someone else's sake are essentially the same event. So that, I believe, motivates why the causative plus applicative pattern and the applicative plus applicative pattern are allowed in the Sanapaná lexicon, but the applicative plus causative pattern is not. So of course, this does not say everything about this morpheme and its distribution. There are languages that do allow applicative plus causative sequences. So while this distribution is iconically motivated, it will take extra steps to explain how it actually came about, and also interestingly why it is even allowable in Sanapaná to add this valency increasing morpheme twice in the cases where the second edition does not seem to have any effect at all. I think I will let you take a look at my conclusions and references on your own time. Thank you very much for your attention.